It seems like with cannabis use becoming more and more common, everybody's got an opinion on how it affects you, especially your brain.
Right.
But this study we're diving into today from JAMA Network Open, it's huge E.
Yeah.
It's like the biggest one of its kind,
Yeah.
looking at how cannabis use actually shows up in the brain using MRI tech.
Yeah. And they looked at young adults, too,
Oh, wow.
between 22 and 36, which is a really important group when we're talking about cannabis use.
Yeah, for sure.
Over 1,000 people.
Wow. Okay, so over 1,000 people, different ages.
Uh-huh.
This must have taken forever.
It did.
Seriously?
Yeah, they didn't just do that. They used 7 different cognitive tests
Oh, wow.
to get a really complete picture of how the brain is working. And what they found was that recent or heavy cannabis use throughout their life was linked to less brain activity when doing tasks that involve working memory.
Okay, hold on. I got to ask.
Sure.
What does statistically significant impact actually mean?
Yeah, that's a great question.
I hear it all the time, but I don't really know.
Yeah. It basically means that the researchers are really confident that the link they found between cannabis use and brain activity wasn't just random or some kind of fluke. It means there's a strong connection.
So it's not just like, oh, these things kind of happen at the same time.
Right.
It's a real finding.
Yeah.
And it's all about working memory.
Uh-huh.
Can you tell me a little bit more about that? Like, what is working memory?
Sure. So working memory, it's kind of like your brain's Post-it note,
Right.
It's a short-term memory system that lets you hold on to information so you can do stuff with it.
Ah.
Like right now, you're using your working memory to follow along with what we're saying, remember what we said,
Oh, wow.
and even think about what you're going to ask next.
Okay, yeah. So it's not just memorizing facts.
Right.
It's like actively using the information.
Exactly. It's
Right,
being
right.
used all the time, like when you remember a phone number to dial it or you're following a recipe.
Wow. So the findings of this study are really hitting home now. It's not just some like abstract brain function. It's how we do things every single day.
Exactly.
Okay.
And what makes this study so interesting is that it shows how vulnerable working memory is when it comes to cannabis use, even in people who hadn't used cannabis right before the test.
So even if you haven't used recently, if you've used a lot in the past, it can still affect you.
That's right.
Wow. That's kind of scary.
It does suggest that there's a lasting impact, which is why this research is so important.
Yeah. Okay. So the researchers were looking at activity in certain areas of the brain during these working memory tasks.
Right.
So like actual parts of the brain that weren't as active.
Yeah.
What parts are we talking about?
They focused on 3 main areas: the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, and the anterior insula.
Okay. So
Yeah, those are kind of mouthfuls.
yeah, so those sound important. What do those parts of the brain do?
They are important. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, it's like the CEO of your brain. It's really involved in planning and making decisions, and that executive control that lets you focus and not get distracted.
So if that part of your brain isn't working well, you might have trouble making decisions or staying organized
Exactly.
or even controlling your impulses.
Yeah, that's right. And then you have the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex, which is all about understanding other people's points of view and regulating your emotions.
Yeah, and if that's messed up, it can be hard to like relate to people or manage your emotions.
Wow.
And then there's the anterior insula, which has to do with self-awareness
Yeah.
and how you process emotions, and even those gut feelings that you get that help you make choices.
Okay, so all this heavy cannabis use, even from way back when, is connected to less activity in these really important brain areas.
Right.
It's like one thing leads to another, and it could end up affecting how we focus or make decisions, or even how we deal with other people and control our emotions.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
It really shows how all these different parts of the brain are linked together. It's not just about each part doing its own thing separately, it's about how they work together.
Okay, so this is all kind of scary, but I remember reading something good in the study about not using cannabis. Like, is there hope for people who want to get their thinking back to how it was?
Yeah, there is some good news.
Okay.
The study found that if you stop using cannabis before doing these thinking tasks, you can actually do better, even if you used a lot in the past.
Oh, so even if there's been some damage, the brain can kind of like fix itself.
Exactly, but it's not always that simple.
Right.
The researcher who led the study, Joshua Gowen, he said that just quitting all of a sudden could actually make things worse for heavy users, especially when they're trying to do something.
Oh, so it's like a delicate balance.
Right.
Okay, so not using cannabis might help, but it might not be easy.
Uh-huh.
What should someone listening to this do if they're worried about their own cannabis use?
I think the most important thing is to be aware. If you know that even past use can affect how well you think, especially your working memory, that helps you make better decisions.
Yeah. I think that makes sense.
Yeah, and hopefully this will lead to more research so people can have even more information to make decisions with.
Right. So speaking of the study, they use something called MRI technology. Can you explain what that is and how it lets us see what's going on in the brain?
Sure, MRI stands for magnetic resonance imaging, and it's a safe way to take pictures of the inside of your body, including the brain, using powerful magnets and radio waves.
Oh, so we can actually see the brain.
Yep. And in this study, they used a special kind of MRI called functional MRI or fMRI.
Okay, so what makes that one special?
fMRI doesn't just show the structure of the brain, it shows the brain working.
Really?
Yeah, it can see changes in blood flow, so we can see which parts of the brain are more active when you're doing certain things.
Wow. Okay, so when people in the study were doing those working memory tasks, the fMRI showed that the parts of the brain we talked about before weren't as active in the people who'd used a lot of cannabis.
Exactly.
So it's not just that the brain is physically different, it's that the different parts aren't working together the same way.
Exactly, and that's a really important finding.
Wow.
It means that cannabis might be messing with how those parts of the brain talk to each other and work together, which could be why it's harder to think and process information.
You know, when we started this deep dive, I thought we'd be talking about like memory loss or something really obvious.
Right.
But now I'm realizing that it's these like hidden things that are being affected.
Mm-hmm.
And that's actually more worrying.
Yeah, it's those basic skills that we don't even think about. And when they're not working right, it can affect so many parts of our lives.
You mentioned that different levels of cannabis use. Did the study say that people who used it a little were affected differently than heavy users?
That's a good question. The study did show that the more cannabis someone used, the bigger the impact on their brain activity. But even moderate use was linked to some level of reduced activity, so it's important to be careful and use responsibly.
Right. And we can't forget that this study was all about young adults whose brains are still developing.
Right.
I wonder if this would be different in older people.
Yeah. It makes you wonder if, like, the earlier you start using it, the worse it could be later on.
That's a great question.
Like almost a domino effect.
Yeah, and one that we really need to look into more.
Right.
We know that our brains change as we get older, so it's totally possible that using cannabis a lot early on could mess with those changes in ways we don't understand yet.
Right. So it's like this ticking time bomb, and we need way more research on what happens over time.
Totally.
Especially for public health.
Yeah.
We need to know what we're dealing with here.
Exactly. And knowing how different ways of using cannabis, like starting young or heavy use, could affect the brain as people age is super important.
Yeah. It could help us with everything from preventing problems to giving people better medical advice.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to go back to something you mentioned before about the limitations of this study. Can you talk about those a little more?
Sure. So, like, every study, this one had some things that might have affected the results. Like, they only looked at young adults, so we don't know if the same thing would happen for teenagers or older people.
Right.
And they also relied on people remembering how much cannabis they used.
Oh, right.
And that's not always accurate. People might not remember exactly how much they used, or they might not want to say.
Makes sense. It can't be easy to study something like that.
Yeah.
What else?
Well, the study couldn't actually prove that using cannabis was the cause of the changes in the brain.
So there could be other things going on that are affecting those brain areas.
It's possible, like maybe lifestyle choices, genes, or things in the environment that weren't part of the study. But even with those limitations, this study was really big and done really well. So it's a big step forward in understanding how cannabis might affect the brain.
Yeah, definitely gives us a lot to think about. And I think one thing that really stands out to me is how much we still don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
We're just starting to figure out how cannabis interacts with the brain, and this study shows us that we need to do a lot more research.
Definitely, especially long-term studies, so we can really see what's going on.
Yeah, so to all our listeners out there, whether you're a regular cannabis user or just interested in the topic, be informed, be smart about your choices, and keep asking questions.
Absolutely. The more we all learn about how cannabis affects us, the better we can take care of ourselves.
Great advice. And to keep your brain going with new information, make sure to like and subscribe to this Unlock Your Mind podcast.